Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Pip, for this invitation. It seems not so long ago I was across the street in the OARC with Donna Kurtz as an office mate, which was lovely, and teaching a few strands here at the summer school. So it's a real privilege and honor to be back and to speak with you and to close this, what I trust has been a fruitful and very productive week for you all. Based on the poem, it's hard to follow up, right, from the sublime to the ridiculous. As my title goes, I want to talk today a bit about so-called big data, what we call the data deluge. So I nicked a slide from Dave DeRoy, which you've probably maybe seen this week, maybe not, maybe. Which is a good, so I think it comes from Christine Borgman, doesn't it, maybe? Yeah. Which gives a sort of, I've always found the slide a bit ambiguous because the people are just sitting there. Yeah? Sorry. I found the slide a bit ambiguous because the people below, the humanists and librarians, social scientists, are just sort of sitting there waiting for the data to fall on their heads in a sort of passive way. But nonetheless, the sort of discourse in the sciences, at least, around big data over the past 10, 15 years has been by and large overly optimistic, or perhaps too optimistic, and at least optimistic. So we know of perhaps Chris Anderson talking about the end of theory after the data deluge helps us all out, the fourth paradigm, the end of science. These are interesting sort of takes on what the sort of information explosion can help in the sciences. And so my interest is in how can we translate this sort of optimism, these sorts of paradigm changes into the humanities, where there's a very different relationship to information and to the data deluge and to this flood of information. And so actually the title references a French novelist, Marguerite Duras. So I come from French literature as my background, so I apologize for the sort of the following many francophone quotes. But she's speaking in a television interview about what François Lyotard had recently coined the information society. And she sort of predicts that we will very soon be literally drowning in information, in a constant flow of information on our bodies, on the future of our bodies, on our health, on our family life, on our salaries, on our leisure time. It's not far from a nightmare. And so in our sort of overly datafied society, I think she had something, she was onto something. This sort of crisis or anxiety about data and too much data and information overload gets translated into the very many Jeremiads against the digital humanities, of which there are too many to count. This is one of my favorite, not the least because he mentions Lyotard, there's a quote there, and then the first sentence is just amazing. Big data is coming for your books. So be careful, from Stephen March. So I'm interested in the two sides of the coin there. I mean, how can we reconcile what information scientists tell us is this great moment where we're going to have a paradigm-changing relationship with all this data, and what humanists, we fear we have too much data already. But this is an old story. This goes back a long way. It goes back at least to the printing press, if not longer. We've always had too much information. There's always been too much to read, too much to know, as Anne Blair has called it, and as Elizabeth Eisenstein described it before. And so there was a sort of always an anxiety about the overwhelming presence of data or text or information. And in fact, you even had these great book wheels that were more imagined than real. I don't think actually anyone ever made. Did they make one? Is there one? Can I see it? Oh, all right. Well, never mind. But these wonderful sort of reading technologies and technologies of information. And so I'm interested also to talk a bit about today about this long history of information technology, of organization of information, and how that belongs rightly to the humanities as a skill. And so if we think back to the beginning of the humanistic enterprise, Erasmus, 1512, he originally embraces this abundance of information. He thinks it's a good thing. And he says that the student who wants to be considered learned must read everything. Diligent as a little bee, and this is a long, tired trope about the bee that flits about through all the gardens of authors to attack all the little flowerlets, and whence he collects some honey which he carries into his own hive. And since there is so much fertility of material in these that they are not able to be plucked off, he will select the most excellent and adapt it to the structure of his work. So this is the sort of humanist's goal, right? You sift through this information, you'll flit around all these great books, you'll find the great parts, you'll bring them back, and you'll move knowledge forward. And this is fine, but you'll see it sort of falls apart. The the tendency we have in the humanities to always fall back on a crisis is pretty strong. It drives us forward. And so by 1523, he's already complaining, is there anywhere on earth exempt of these swarms of new books? So from the diligent bee flitting about to these swarms of new book that's going to overtake him. And then Jean Baudin, the great French humanist, he says, the life of man, however prolonged, is hardly sufficient to read all the available books. So it's no longer possible, as perhaps it was generations before, to think of reading the entire library. It's become too big. Leibniz, a century later, talks about the horrible mass of books which keeps on growing. In the end, the disorder will become nearly insurmountable. The indefinite multitude of authors will shortly expose them all to the danger of general oblivion. So it's pretty anxious as far as the crisis goes. Alexander Pope is a bit more poetic. He lived in the days after Providence had permitted the invention of printing as a scourge on the sins of the learned. Paper also became so cheap and printers so numerous that a deluge of authors covered the land. So another deluge, this time of writers, which is just as bad as information. And finally, Edgar Allan Poe, in the 19th century, when there was a great explosion of mechanized printing, the enormous multiplication of books in every branch of knowledge is one of the greatest evils of the age. It presents one of the most serious obstacles to the acquisition of correct information. So I think this could be relevant today in our post-news, post-fact, fake news world. So this sort of moment of crisis in the humanities is interesting, but there's also there are also ways of thinking about how to embrace abundance. So, and this is a fundamental technology, a fundamental goal that we had. And the encyclopédie, so this is the great French 18th century encyclopédie of Diderot and d'Alembert, thought very long and hard, and I'll talk at length about the encyclopédie later. But what they saw it is that they described the situation thusly, that the encyclopédie of the 18th century was this moment where you could look back and you look forward, and it was pivotal in between. And so as centuries pass by, Diderot tells us, the mass of works grows endlessly. One can foresee a time when it will be almost as difficult to educate oneself in the library as in the universe. That brings up his notion of the library being equal to the universe. If one imagines the realm of lectures in the days before the invention of the printing press, we see a small number of people of genius busy creating and a countless throng of workers busy transcribing. So that was the sort of humanistic endeavor before the printing press. If we look forward to us and think of the same realm, once printing, which never rests, has filled huge buildings with books, we can think of the Swindon repository, perhaps, of the Bodleian, we will find it once more split into two classes of people. There will be those who read little and immerse themselves in new research or what they take to be new. I guess these are scientists now, maybe. The others, workmen incapable of producing anything, will be busy leafing through those books night and day and separating out what they deem worthy of being anthologized and preserved. This is sadly the humanities scholar. But it's presented a bit negatively here, but it's not meant to be. If you were to read on, Diderot says this is the most important thing to do, is to be able to separate out what's worthy of being anthologized and preserved. Because if one day all the books disappear, if one day culture falls apart, if there's some catastrophe, if you just have this one book, this encyclopédie, you could rebuild society. So the idea of finding the best among this sea of data was for him a noble enterprise. And so this gets us back to the subject, big data in the humanities. Do we have big data? Can we use these tools? This is something I've been thinking about for the past 10 years or so, where in humanity we discover that we have data, and then all of a sudden, of course, it becomes a crisis, right? We have too much data. It's a long story. There's never enough time to read everything. But nonetheless, we're confronted, whether we know it or not, with a sort of algorithmic interface with data anymore. If you use Google Books, if you use Google, if you use any sort of finding aid, there's a set of decisions algorithmically made underneath of that sometimes we take for granted or we don't notice at all. And so my preliminary questions here would be, are approaches borrowed from the hard sciences, information sciences, appropriate for humanities research? Why not? But there is a growing question of, can you just take methods from the sciences, apply them to the humanities? It's what they did in the 19th century. And there was, to varying degrees of success under positivism. Does big data need big theory? So to respond to Chris Anderson, what are the theoretical, some would say ideological underpinnings of these algorithmic data-intensive approaches? And how can traditional humanities theories, the sort of intellectual framework on which we rest our works, be brought into conversation with data-centric models and modes of analysis? How does big data change the way we read and we research? So much like Erasmus thought about with these new books, we had to change our mode of reading. So for him, it was less about reading intensively, as in one book over, and then reading in fragments, right? Finding the best bits of all these works and placing them in the proper thing. How do we now change our research and reading methods? So one way of thinking about this would be distant reading, which is Franco Moretti's position on the matter, where distance, he says, is a condition of knowledge. It allows us to focus on units that are much smaller or much larger than the text. And if between the very small and the very large, the text itself disappears, Moretti's fine with that. So for him, you know, you have to scale up, basically, and you have to say that we're no longer going to read these small, discrete things. We're either going to read something that's very small, that doesn't belong to the text as a whole, or we're not going to read the text at all. Another way of thinking about this, and this was one of the courses Martin Wynn and I gave at the summer school on scalable reading. And this would be to think about a way of moving between these sort of two poles, right? That the pole that you can't really get rid of close reading, you can't do distant reading without close reading, or vice versa. And that would be, we need to design interfaces that allow us to move back and forth. And this is an idea that comes from Martin Mueller at Northwestern and our work in Chicago. And it also means, and Martin Mueller, he said, and I think rightly so, that this form of what he calls not reading, as in not reading intensively, not reading in a close reading manner, but of counting things, of reading other bits of text that aren't of the whole text, it has a longer history. It goes back to 19th century philology. It's in fact a lot of what we do as researchers. By not reading, we examine concordances, for example. We look at metadata rather than the texts themselves. We generate frequency lists. We generate classifications, feature sets, collocation tables. All of these things are forms of not reading, or of reading in a different way, given the data. But we can also use these to sort of inform our intellectual frameworks and our theoretical frameworks on which we're building these tools. So we can track literary topoi from a Curtius standpoint. We can think about conceptual history, Reinhard Cassellet's Begriffsgeschichte, epistemic change, intertextual networks, discourse networks, all of these over time across genres. So this can impact a variety of different fields if we think about a new sort of computational hermeneutics that takes into account not only the distant, but also the close. So this comes from Andrew Piper, and it's a sort of notion of a new hermeneutics, or a new hermeneutic circle built on the notion of modeling. So you have to model what it is you're thinking about, iterative development and verification, and interactive reading at both the micro and micro levels. And I think this is a really interesting and fascinating idea, and it's something that is hard for us because it takes a lot of collaboration in many senses. So we have to sort of let go of the sort of basis of our research, which could be an object, could be a text. Think about modeling a few texts, work with computer scientists, work with information scientists, and think about how this can then come back and inform the system and change. So it becomes an iterative system, one that is always changing. And so we've thought about this to use these sorts of approaches with, again, this 18th century encyclopedia, which for us, for my work, has been particularly rich source of reflection on method, and for a variety of reasons. So if you don't know this work, it's a large work in the mid-18th century. It was 28 volumes of work, 11 volumes of plates, 17 volumes of text, 75,000 articles, 140 contributors. So it was it was a sort of Wikipedia of its time. Or more correctly, the Wikipedia is the encyclopedia of today. It's an unanachronistic way to say it. So it was written by a group of authors. So, and it's self-reflective. They're thinking about this moment of information overload, of abundance, and how they can write a book that's at the same time a compendium of all knowledge and also a tool for thinking. And so it becomes, in many ways, a sort of microcosm of the world in which we live now. All right, the world in which we're constantly trying to figure out what's the good information, how can we find it, what do we do with it, and how we can help others find it and link to it. So these are all technologies that you've encountered this week, undoubtedly, in your different strands, from knowledge representation, from linked open data, all of these. And so just to give you a sense of this self-reflection, what they're talking about, they constantly, D'Alembert, well, he was a mathematician, he constantly says it's pretty easy. We'll just set everything out this way, and people will know what to do. And then Diderot, who's a philosopher, is less sold on the idea that it's so simple. But he says it has to be simple, that if we are to consider this viewpoint from above, it must be simple, because there is rarely grandeur without simplicity. It must be clear and accessible. It must not be a tortuous labyrinth where we might become lost. So he says you have to build this sort of information system in a way that people can get out of it, they can make sense of it, they can make their way through it, and not become lost, which is always a danger. But then a few paragraphs later, he describes what actually happens when they try to do it. As we've seen, we have labored, the material expand, the wordless become more recondite, contents reintroduced under a host of different names, instruments, machines, and operations multiply beyond measure, and the numerous turns of an inextricable labyrinth become ever more complicated. So he's already can't get out of the labyrinth that he's made. We have seen how much effort it took to confirm that the same things were the same, and how difficult it was to confirm that others which seemed quite different were not different. So if you've worked on sort of ontologies this week, you'll feel Diderot's pain, right? So trying to think of a universal vocabulary is very difficult. Nonetheless, we wanted to take sort of their notion of organization and linking of knowledge and see if we could apply sort of big data machine learning techniques to it. And so the idea here would be to pair up a theoretical framework with a big data approach, right? So we would want to think, so we'll think about knowledge representation, historical ontologies, using supervised classification, discourse analysis using unsupervised topic modeling classification, and then sequence alignment and large-scale text reuse to think about intertextuality. So I'll get into all these in a bit. The first way of thinking about it is the organization or representation of knowledge. And so at the very beginning of the encyclopédie, they published this tree or graph, which is called the Système figuré des connaissances humaines. And D'Alembert tells us that, after thinking about the different parts of knowledge and the characteristics that distinguish them, it remains for us only to make a genealogical tree or an encyclopedic tree, so it's a graph in a tree, which will gather the various branches of knowledge together under a single point of view and will serve to indicate their origin and their relationship to one another. So this is based on a sort of Baconian model, Francis Bacon, where its understanding is divided into three branches. So memory, three faculties: memory, reason, and imagination, which we get history, philosophy, and poetry. So it's also, in as much as it is a tree, it can be represented in a more arborescent manner, as it was sort of 20 years later, which is the same representation just put into tree form. So it's a graph, it's a map, and it's a tree. It's the Meridian trifecta. It's also a world map, he says, which is to show the principal countries, their position, and their mutual dependence, and the road that leads directly from one to another. These individual maps will be the different articles of the encyclopédie, and the tree or systematic chart will be its world map. So it's a way of sort of zooming in to the article. And so each article, you could think of Beau here is is a leaf on the branch of metaphysics, right? Or maybe it's an XPath if you were in the TEI strand. Think of it as an XPath, right? And so for us, the encyclopédie has 74,000 articles. Most of them, not all of them, were given these classifications. So for some reason, some didn't have it. And so for us, it became a sort of tailor-made automatic classification exercise, right? So whenever you have a data set that has known labels, unknown labels, you can train your data set on those knowns to predict and classify the unknowns. So that's what we did. So we generated an ontology using multiple classifiers. I won't get too far into the specifics. We used a naive Bayes classifier, which worked better on smaller articles, a KNN, which worked better on bigger ones, and then we used a third one that made a decision between when the two disagreed. So to get separately, they're about 65 to 68% right. Together, we got them up to 78% using the decision tree between the two. And this is fine. We stopped there. We didn't push it any further because we weren't really interested in approaching 100%. One, because I think it's impossible, but I don't know. Two, because if we did achieve it, it would be really uninteresting because we just have what we started with. So there would be nothing to sort of prompt us on. So our takeaways from this was, one, that the original classification scheme was far too specific, that they had 2,900 classes, some of which only had one article in it, which is not a way to build an ontology. it's not good. So the algorithm comes in and says, well, I can do better. I can put everything in 360 classes. And it does. So it should raise a question about the loss of specificity here, but nonetheless, it's very efficient. So at the end of the day, we were left with 47,000 articles, which were correctly classified, fine. Others that were incorrectly classified, which tended to be the most interesting things to think of, right? We did get an information gain in the unclassified articles, but it's the ones where there's a disagreement between the human and the computer that really prompts an investigation. So it became a heuristic tool. You know, you were in an article by Voltaire, Esprit, which is about wit and other things, and it gets classified as chimie, as chemistry, and you say, oh, the machine's stupid, you know, what is stupid? But it causes you to go back and read the article, which is a good thing. It causes you to think about how esprit is used in the encyclopedia itself. And it turns out, aside from Voltaire's article, the word esprit is used as in spirits, as in an alchemical, chemical term. So it was highly weighted to chemistry, and it's in fact the Voltaire article that's a bit of an outlier in this. So it again prompts you to sort of move back into the data, move from this strange sort of algorithmically generated thing back into the text itself. It also helped us think about this large-scale view. Can we get a different view? Is there a different organization going on in the encyclopedia that's perhaps not represented as in the system figuré? And this, again, is something that D'Alembert invites us to do. He says that all classifications, all ontologies are completely arbitrary, right? One can create as many different systems of human knowledge as there are world maps having different projections. And each one of these systems might even have some particular advantage possessed by none of the others. So keep generating different models in an iterative fashion until you find something that could be interesting and a new way into your data. And so we took, in this case, the classes, not the articles, so the 360 classes that came out of our ontology, and we compared them to each other. We clustered them using a centroid clustering algorithm, cosine distance. And what we got was fairly interesting because we had 3 clusters, just like the 3 Baconian faculties, but at the top was more or less the humanities as we'd think about them. In the middle, the physical sciences, chemistry, and then biological, maybe what we consider medical and natural history at the bottom. So this would suggest that on some level, an underlying organization in the encyclopedia itself is much more forward-looking to the 19th century, to when these disciplines become coalesced in this way in the modern university, than it was in the Baconian model, which was in very much backwards looking to a sort of medieval understanding of the faculties. So this prompted us to think of what were the relationships between these classes that weren't dependent on these disciplines, on these classes that were given to us by the encyclopedia. And so the second sort of theoretical construct we wanted to think of was using discourse analysis. So this is a discourse analysis in the French sphere. It's part of the linguistic turn in the 60s, becomes a pretty hot topic in the late 60s. And there's a guy who's pretty much forgotten today, but he's fascinating, named Michel Pecheux. And he was a student of Louis Althusser, and he was at this group in Saint-Cloud, who was one of the first groups working on computational linguistics. And so he wrote an algorithm called the automatic discourse analysis algorithm, which I don't know if it's ever really run. But he was very concerned about finding ideology. So in this sense of the Althusserian notion of ideology that's out there, and I just like the book cover on this one, which is why I include it. And so Pecheux wrote this algorithm, had these publications, but then he's immediately eclipsed by another Michel, Michel Foucault, who in 1969 publishes The Archaeology of Knowledge, which posits himself a different way of thinking about discourse analysis, which is much less formal than Pecheux's semantic analysis. And this sort of takes off in the humanities, if you've noted. There's a discourse analysis in the Foucauldian sense is a bit everywhere these days. But Foucault sort of tells us that in discourse themselves, in freeing words and things, so what he calls the embrace, apparently so tight of words and things, and the emergence of a group of rules proper to the discursive practices, he says these practices are in fact what systematically form the objects of that they speak. So it doesn't have to be syntactic relationship, it doesn't have to be a structural formulation at all. It's a set of discursive practices that allow us to say what we can say, and that of course are bound up in power relations from a Foucauldian sense. But we took this a bit cheekily to say that this concept of archaeology that is non-syntactic, non-semantic, might very well justify the bag of words informational model, analytical model that's used in much information retrieval, as it frees us from a sort of exclusive interest in language as structure. And that given the current growth of digital text collections, can we sort of revisit Pêcheur's notion of an automatic discourse analysis to find traces of these discursive practices? So here we turn to latent Dirichlet allocation. So it's a topic modeling algorithm. I taught it here once, but I don't know that anyone teaches it again. We topic modeled the Bible, and it was intense. It was an intense session. Anyway, it's a tool that's used fairly prevalently in the digital humanities because there's a certain amount of subjective nature. I think there's a certain amount of reading that's still involved. It was a method of analyzing text developed by David Bly at Princeton at the time, Andrew Ning and Michael Jordan. And so we built our model connected to a relational database of the encyclopédie, still in the encyclopédie, trying to think about if we could do 360 topics, 320 topics, to roughly have as many topics as there were disciplines, as classes, to see not only if we could identify first the disciplinary discourses. So the first thing we had to say, well, is there a chemistry topic? And there was, so we were on the right track, and there was botany, and there was all these, but then there were other things that sort of go through, this is what the most interesting thing, there were topics that went through the different classes. So human rights, for example, morality, the body. So the body as a discourse on the body can appear in medical articles, it can appear in physics articles, it can appear in articles on morality. So it was that sort of transversal, discursive relationship of articles that we're interested in generating. And so here, again, as a heuristic tool of investigating what these articles may or may not be about, we find this really interesting. So a small article like Poisson, which is classified in one of these overly specific classes that only has one article, sacred criticism, for fish. You're sort of, I don't know what this is, I don't know why. But if you look at the topic, I mean, if you read it, it's about how you can prepare a fish for a ceremony, for a Jewish ceremony. And so what it comes back in the topic model, and you can see here the weights that begin to show its prevalence, it's about fish anatomy, it's about Jewish practices, it's about the ancients in a more general sense, and then animal anatomy. So it gives you an idea of what's going on in an article that's perhaps not in its label at all. In this case, we wouldn't get that from that label. Or another article, Fermeté, so firmness, by Voltaire, is about morals, eloquence, properties of matter. Sensualism is one of these discourses that sort of pervades all of the articles in the encyclopédie. It's very important. And it's true, this is an article, it's a grammatical article where Voltaire talks about you have to have a firm style, you have to have firm morals, matter will be this, and it's about sensualism. So this is a way, again, of exploding the sort of disciplinary boundaries of the encyclopédie using discursive practices. We can also map these, creating a different sort of way of, so here we're calling natural rights, a discourse around natural rights. Where does it occur? In what articles? In what classes? And with what frequency? So here you might say, well, it only occurs 30 times in its own class of knowledge, which might be interesting, and it's double in the class grammar. So what's going on here? So again, you click in as a sort of heuristic tool, and you find an article like inviolable, so that's inviolable, inalienable. And Diderot, this is an unsigned article by Diderot, so it's been attributed later. And here, it's just a small article. He just says, here's this word, that which should not be violated. La liberté de conscience, so he gives a use case. La liberté de conscience, c'est un privilège inviolable. So the freedom of thought is an inalienable right? So he's giving that as a use case. And that's a radical thing to put in, at this time, in this dictionary, right? As a use case. And so it's a way of sort of hiding these small discursive things within what's seemingly an innocuous article. Jaucourt, Le Chevalier de Jaucourt does pretty much the same thing in the article Règlement, which is another article in grammar, where he basically says that it's natural law, not positive law, that should take precedence. And you might say, well, that's fine. But that presupposes that you could get rid of any government that you don't like, because it's not based in natural law. So it's a hugely radical statement that's just thrown out there as a use case to define règlement. So these are the sorts of discursive practices that we try to find. If we look at morale and morality, it's discourse where it belongs. You can sort of find these little islands. And you go to ancient geography. So what's going on in ancient geography? Again, another seemingly innocuous article, and unsigned by Didier Roe, but attributed later, where he describes this ancient people in Thrace. And he says they had very different morality than we do. They behaved differently. They didn't believe in marriage, and all this stuff. And he says, really, it's not nature, it's tyranny that imposes upon the head of humans a weight that's so hard that they come to hate their condition. And so it's a way of thinking about moral relativism, which was a very dangerous thing. It was a very Diderot way of thinking. But again, he questions this notion that any government that does that to you, you have the right to overthrow it. So anyone that tells you that. So this is a radical discourse, a discourse that exists in the Encyclopédie, but that wouldn't come through normally just by looking up ancient geography or grammar. We can also think about discourses as evolving over time. So this more classical sort of discourse on commerce or a mercantilist idea is prevalent in the beginning volumes of the Encyclopédie, but then sort of peters out, whereas the more physiocratic political economy comes at the end and sort of has a more glorious ascent. So it's a way of just thinking about these are different objects. Again, it's reorganizing this text in a way that changes it fundamentally in a way of reading it and of generating links between articles that perhaps you wouldn't have seen before. And then finally, the third sort of theoretical framework on which I've based a lot of work recently is intertextuality, which is this sort of, it's everywhere and nowhere in the humanities. Every text is an intertext, according to Roland Barthes. But it's true, this is sort of at the basis of humanistic, at least in the textual-based disciplines, you're constantly trying to find texts and how they're related to other texts. It's just a basic thing of what we do. It's a key element. And Roland Barthes in 1973, he sets it out. Every text, he says, is a new network of bygone citations. So every text is made up of all the older texts, just sort of reassembled. Harold Bloom, same time, across the pond, talks about criticism as the art of knowing the hidden roads that goes from poem to poem. So it's sort of the same idea that this is what we do as humanists, this is what we do as critics. And we're trying to operationalize that in a computational sense. And so the very basic bones of this is let's find two texts that have matching passages, or at least closely matching passages, right? And so here we've turned to sequence alignment, which is a technique of identifying regions of similarity shared by two strings or sequences. It's used in bioinformatics, plagiarism detection, if you've ever used Turnitin, it's the same basic idea. Or in a reverse sense for text collocation, which looks for small differences in two similar traditions. So for us, we started out using these algorithms from bioinformatics. So it was a real sort of interdisciplinary borrowing. And we started with what's known as the BLAST algorithm, which is used in musicology, used in bioinformatics, in computational linguistics. And it's fairly simple in its way. So it breaks down text into what are called n-grams. And we look for these common n-grams. We filter out content words and other non-important things. We flatten accents. We adjust these parameters. And for us, it was very important to get a high degree of flexibility. One, because a lot of the data sets on which we work are uncorrected OCR. And so something like Turnitin is just far too strict. And two, because what we're really interested in is reuse as a function, as a cultural function. And so when Diderot uses, let's say, a Latin poet, is he quoting from memory? Is he misquoting? Is he misquoting on purpose? These are the small differences are really, really interesting. So we weren't that interested in finding exact things. So if you just take the first line of Rousseau's social contract, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. We break this down. This is what the sort of n-grams look like, and you can see they're overlapping. The algorithm goes through it, finds a matching anchor, and then it goes in both directions to find these passages. And so what we find, again, with the Encyclopédie moving out is fairly interesting. Not that the Encyclopédie used Pierre Bayle, who was just a predecessor, another dictionary before them, but he was also a radical thinker. But the usages are very important. So here in the Encyclopédie, the Abbé Yvon is concluding his article in the voice of Bayle. So he's taken Bayle's passage and he concludes, je finis, so that I am concluding my remarks with this. So this is Bayle talking in the Encyclopédie, but without any indication that it's someone else. And so these techniques sort of give us a way of repopulating an author list that's actually larger than what comes down to us. And we can do this with dirty OCR, as we said, with works in translation. So here's a translation of Locke's second treatise, which we found snippets of that Jaucourt is using all through his article on government, with no indication that it's Locke, and for a good reason, because the second treatise was a banned work in France. And so if he would have said, here's Locke's second treatise, I'm going to cite it, the Encyclopédie would have been censored. It would have lost its privilege to publish. And so nonetheless, we can find all the passages of Locke, well, most of the passages of Locke in the Encyclopédie, which led us to think about citation politics and policy in the Encyclopédie. So not all works are created equal. Not all works can be cited equally in the Encyclopédie. You could cite La Henriade of Voltaire because it was a non-controversial work. You could cite it all you wanted. You could never cite the Lettres philosophiques, the letters on the English nation, because it was a banned and burned work. But nonetheless, they wanted to find ways to use it, and they did. So Jaucourt uses a long quote here, which is actually two separate quotes from two separate works. And he says, it is from Voltaire, but he gives a very innocuous title, Mélange de littérature et philosophie, so it's just somewhere in this mixture of Voltaire. But this is clearly from the Letters on the English Nation, which is again a way of smuggling in an illegal text into what was a legal document of the Encyclopédie. And the sort of lengths they went to hide this was directly related to how dangerous these works were. Right? So this one is from De l'Esprit, Helvétius. So De l'Esprit was a very dangerous work. It was also banned. It was indirectly responsible for the Encyclopédie losing its publication privilege. But nonetheless, Jaucourt decides I'm going to cite, or not cite. He just doesn't say any. He says one thing, I'll show you. But there's no quotation marks. There's no structural form that this is a citation, other than this small little blip, where he says, c'est dit un beau génie de ce siècle. So it is, says, a subtle genius of our century. So this is a tip of the hat to the cognoscente, right? There's a quotation here. There's something going on here. And perhaps readers knew that this was Helvétius. I don't know. We can't reconstruct that. We certainly would lose this. If we're reading through the Encyclopédie, you would just say, I have no idea who that is. You could maybe Google some words. You could maybe reconstruct it. But we certainly have lost the sort of engagement with the text that could have said, oh, yeah, that's Helvétius. And there's a certain code for this, too. Then when they say, un philosophe historien, so the historian philosopher is Voltaire. Le plus beau génie de ce siècle, so the best genius of the century, is Montesquieu. So it's just through reading it, you get to know their tics. But this is something that we've drawn out from that. And we published this with Van Edelstein at Stanford, a full study of all these different citation practices. But that also led us to sort of, again, with Bayle, to introduce new voices into the Encyclopédie. So this current work that I've been working on is looking at Émilie du Châtelet, who's a fascinating figure. She was Voltaire's lover. They lived together at her chateau in Cirey for 10 years. They did all these experiments. She translated Newton, which is still used today in France. She was, by all intents and purposes, much smarter than Voltaire. And she writes this introduction to metaphysics, purportedly for her like 2-year-old son, but I don't think he got much out of it. But it's called Les éléments de physique, and it was widely used. And so she was a great figure, but she just happened to be a woman. And so, in fact, it's used in some of the most important metaphysical articles. Some of the articles are just completely hypothèse, so hypothesis is, I would say, an Émilie du Châtelet article. It's completely drawn from her work, but she's not mentioned in it. So this is a way, and this is just a sort of du Châtelet, how she's worked. This is a way of giving a voice back to Émilie du Châtelet, but also giving a better description of what is actually in the Encyclopédie. So there was many reasons why maybe they didn't cite her, but it was probably just intellectual laziness in this case. We can also think about using these same techniques outside of the Encyclopédie. Will finally emerge outside of the Encyclopédie here. And here I take inspiration from Bob Darnton, who thinks about, this is his pre-digital communication circuit. So this is how media circulates in the 18th century, according to Bob Darnton. So we wanted to think about, well, can we use these algorithms to replicate some of this, right? How do texts circulate in non-publishable ways? And so one of the great databases for this is right here at Oxford, the Electronic Enlightenment. So it's almost 70,000 letters, right? So it's correspondences, starting with Voltaire, starting with Rousseau, Adam Smith. It's multilingual. It's a great resource. So using these same algorithms to get into the correspondences is a way of thinking about how our text not only circulating, but how are they talked about in a social aspect. And to think about events, both literary, cultural, and historical. And so we know that in November 1st, 1755 is the great earthquake in Lisbon. And it sort of rocks Voltaire to his core. He begins to question everything and the first thing he questions is divine providence. So if there is a God and he lets this happen in Lisbon, he's an evil God, and I don't want to believe in him. So he writes this poem on the disaster of Lisbon in December of 1755. By 2nd of January 1756, we already get snippets of it in the correspondence. So it's already circulating around, but it's just 1 or 2 verses. And the reason for that is that it's a work that he's reworking. And we're using we're comparing it with a modern edition. The modern edition has the full text, but it gets longer. So you can see through March, he's reworking it and the passages get a bit longer. And then by 27th of March, we have a fairly retouched. It even says that he heard the great poet come in and give this reworked work. And then, so it's a way of thinking about how Voltaire he's sending out snippets of this poem to his interlocutors. He's trying to see what comes back, and then he's changing his poem based on how the letters come back to him. So it's a way of reconstructing the writing process through this. And it's also a way of thinking about a media event. So finally, Rousseau gets this. Someone writes to Rousseau and says, have you seen this awful poem that questions divine providence? Rousseau, never one to back down, writes a 7,000-word letter response to Voltaire, talking about, and it's called On Optimism. So it's about why we should believe in divine providence and should be optimistic. And so this gets published. Rousseau claims he never wanted it to be published, but 1759, which is an important year, because in the same year, Voltaire publishes Candide, ou l'Optimisme, which just tears apart Rousseau completely and becomes one of the bestsellers of the century. So it's a way of thinking about giving a more of a depth to these publication histories through these technologies. We also come to think about commonplaces, so words that are, or snippets that are repeated over and over. So Latin, of course, is a great source. Here's some Juvenal. These aren't related to each other, but they're the same passage in different correspondences, right? But some are clearly related. So we have one that we found. This is comparing all of electronic enlightenment to itself, basically, to find out what are the passages that get repeated the most. And so François Rabelais, he makes up his own commonplace at some point, and it's in Latin, Magnus Manus Clericus, non sum Magnus Manus Sapientis. So the greatest of clerks are not always the wisest of men. Montaigne, who's a great commonplacer, picks it up. He cites Rabelais, and then it goes on in the 18th century to have a great afterlife with Voltaire. Precisely at the moment he's writing Candide, he rereads Rabelais, he picks up this commonplace, and he starts throwing it out to friends in a coded way of criticizing the government without criticizing his friends that are part of the government. So he says, you know, the Marquis de Montespan, he's a nice guy, he's trying his best, but you know, as Rabelais tells us, the wisest of clerks are not always the greatest of men. You know, so it's a way of sort of foisting off critique, and then they come back to him. It comes back. He uses it with interlocutors. It comes back to him in a way, and so we can begin to think about how these circulate. And this led to a larger project that we did here with Oxford, between Chicago and Oxford, or the Digging into Data project, where we thought about, up to this point, moving from the encyclopedia, we were thinking about it in terms of an author. So an author or a source, right? So you had an author and you had a source, and the author's using another source. But what if we got rid of that and just compared a huge database to itself and tried to find out what were the repeated passages that came out? Would we be able to build a sort of virtual commonplace book from this? And we tried. But again, relying on this notion of this was a period of information overload, that there were new reading technologies, and one of the most successful, at least in the English-speaking world, but also in French, was the idea of commonplacing, right? So this was an act of reading, but it also became an act of composition. So while you were reading, and this is John Locke's commonplace book, first published in French, while you were reading, you'd find a passage that you liked, and you'd write it down. And then you need to organize it. And so Locke had this great organizational system, which looks like a database. It is a sort of field and table, and this is how you do it. And the idea wasn't that it's just so you could organize your commonplaces, is that when you're writing next, and you need to find it, you need to extract this and use it, then this would be a way of doing it. So the idea was we can't computationally get at a moment of reading in the past, because that's gone and it's phenomenological anyway. But you could get at this moment of redeployment. So if somebody has made a commonplace and then they redeploy it, we could find it in some. We'll see if this was successful or not. We aimed high. We had a good ambitions. We found the biggest database we could. That's ECHO in the 18th century. And so it's not without its problems, but it's the most comprehensive data set in the 18th century. Most printed items in England that we use. So 205,000 volumes across 7 major subject areas. So the first thing we had to do was reduce dimensionality within this comparison. So if we wanted to compare the whole thing to each other, it would be 42 billion possible connections. It would take forever. We didn't want to. So we had to. There are a fair amount of. They're not duplicates. It's not fair to call them duplicates because they're not the same work, but they're different editions. They're the same text, if you want, pretty much. So we were able to get rid of many of those. We developed here at Oxford, Alfie, who was here but is no longer here, Rabdu Alman. She developed with Min Chen a visual analytics system to help us refine the algorithms, and then we merged these variants using this system into commonplace groups. So to give you an idea of what it is, about 43% of ECHO we found were duplicates, were sort of the same text. So we were able to get rid of those using different heuristics. We used the visual analytics system to get our algorithm flexible enough to use this dirty OCR. So it's an uncorrected OCR, some of which is very bad, some of which is not so bad, but it was done 15 years ago, so they're not going to redo it. So this is the Vita system developed by Alfie to help us do it. And then we came to the point where we could find passages. This is some idea. This will give you some idea. This is the same passage, the Lord's Prayer. So what's underlined are the differences all coming from the bad OCR. So again, to design an algorithm that can say this is the same text when clearly there are these differences. But we ran into some problems, one being one work in particular. So I'll see if you can guess. So in religion and philosophy, that module, 23,000 volumes, it shouldn't have taken that long. It ended up in the system we were using taking a month, is that right? Started on March 2nd, finished on March 27th. It generated 17 million potential commonplaces. So it's the Bible, right? The Bible was a huge problem, just technically. So we had to actually, which is one of my great, as an American, one of my great joys, is to know that I helped develop a turn the Bible off filter. A button that just says turn the Bible off. And it goes away. And almost half of our almost half of our alignments go away. So almost half of the reuses we found in ECHO were from the Bible. 42 million, so 21 million. So that's a lot. But it nonetheless allowed us to sort of clear the field and begin to see some interesting things. So we also then had to develop an algorithm that could look at two passages which we say as humans, these are the same, they're the same thing. The computer says, no, they're different. And so in this case, these are 3 passages from this poem, The Seasons, Spring, by James Thompson, which are in fact the same passage. And so we had to train an algorithm that was flexible enough that could say that could assign all these to the same package. And it's a very difficult task, but what we ended up using is called a skipgram method. So this is the opposite of the matching algorithm, where you make I call it a donut n-gram, because there's a hole in the middle. So in this case, you have the infant reason grows apace and calls for the kind hand of an assiduous care. These n-grams become infant grows, with reason skipped. Then reason becomes the next anchor, reason apace, grows calls. And these are much more rare, you can imagine, in matching. So if you find 2 passages that share like 2 of these, you can pretty much say with good authority these are the same passage. So that allowed us to make these groups and find out that it turns out that this poem, Spring by James Thompson, was a great viral hit in the 1730s, and I had never read it. So it allowed us also to think about a typology of text reuse. So what were we looking at? How were these passages reused? Because not all passages are commonplaces, not all reuses are different things. And so first you had a first use, and in many cases this was outside of the 18th century, so that was difficult. We had to introduce EBO, we had to introduce a Latin corpus, a Greek corpus to go through. Then you have reeditions, single-authored collections, critical works, anthologies, exempla, and then finally a creative reuse by individuals. Our hypothesis within this is that passages move into commonplace territory somewhere between 4 and 6, so somewhere between annotation and exempla. And you can sort of then use the system to trace a sort of what we call a life cycle of a commonplace. So the first use here of this passage by James Thompson is, of course, 1728. Which we find in 1730 as a reedition. And then in 1738, it's already been commonplace. It's already been anthologized, right? It's the art of rhetoric made easy. So it's already been used as an example. But it's a fairly long passage. And what we see with most of these, when they become commonplaces, they get shorter and shorter until they're pithy enough to be used. And so we keep continuing along, and it shows up in an essay on immorality, Thoughts Moral and Divine, the Poetical Miscellany, and then finally, in 1764, it shows up in a novel, just used as 2 lines, to rear the tender thought and teach the young idea how to shoot. Just thrown out in the midst of a novel, which, again, you wouldn't really know where this came from. But clearly, this is a way of thinking about this sort of commonplace. And then you can trace it up to the end of the 18th century. So this is all live in Chicago. And it allowed us also to think about how we can change our vision of a literary system just based on reuses, right? So these are the top authors that are reused. And it's not really fair because Shakespeare is so far ahead of number 2 that it's not, I mean, it's an order of at least an order of magnitude more. But there he is. So it's a bit canonical, but nonetheless. But you have Shakespeare, you have the ancients, obviously, you have people that predated the 18th century, Milton, Dryden, Johnson, Shakespeare. You have some French, Green. And then you have sort of weird people that pop out, like Edward Bish, and you say, well, who's this? Or maybe Ephraim Chambers. I don't know if you know who he is. But these are the commonplaces. These are the great So Edward Bish writes a British Parnassus. He writes a commonplace book of English poetry. So Edward Bish is important not as a contributor to culture, but as somebody that organizes the commonplaces in such a way that they can then feed out into the other things. And then the encyclopedia, then Ephraim Chambers writes his own encyclopedia, which started as his commonplace book. And he's the one that gets his commonplace technique from John Locke, and that's how he organizes all of his knowledge. So this is, again, this notion that goes back to Diderot and where are we to deal with this information. One of our prime duties would be to find ways of organizing information, the best information, and then disseminating it to others. So this is where people like Chambers and Bish become very important. And it goes back to this sort of notion of commonplacing, which still exists. You find them all the time. I don't know, online you find these citation farms, right? So you can get a t-shirt made of this Thompson quote that I just traced through the 18th century at isquotes.com. So this sort of thing still exists. And so the idea, I think, there's a, for lack of a better term, there's a commonplace out there that students are getting stupider because they don't read in a linear fashion and they don't read these big, and that's just not true. We've never really read like that except at one small point in the 19th century when the landed classes decided it was fun to go in a garden and read a novel for 4 hours, but nobody has time for that. So we've always read in fragments. We've always been a sort of Twitter-pated society, and so we can get back at that sort of notion with these big data approaches. So I'll just sort of leave on this back to this notion of embracing this abundance with a sort of more critical eye than perhaps Chris Anderson and those at Wired have, but how we can sort of use these data sets that are coming into us to swim upstream, if you will, of the data deluge in the humanities in a way that helps us see from a distance, but also valorize our points of entry into our fields. And so this is a quote I've always liked from Christine Borgman, to come back to her, that as the absolute volume of data increases, the ability to inspect individual observations decreases. The observer must step away ever further away from the phenomena of interest. New tools and new perspectives are required. However, big data is not necessarily better data. The farther the observer is from the point of origin, the more difficult it can be to determine what those observations mean. So I think this is our point here. In the digital humanities, this is where we can really shine, is in a way of stepping back, but also making sure that we don't become alienated from the objects of our research, right? That we don't just farm this, we don't in the first instance run away of the sort of new neo-Ludditism and say, oh, there's too much data, I can't do anything with this, I'll just go back and read my novel in the yard for 4 hours. That's not a good, productive response. Or in a second sense, just say, oh, the computer scientists will nut it out, they'll figure it out, they know what they're doing, you know, because this introduces a layer between us and our books, between us and our objects of research that I don't think necessarily needs to be there, that we need to at least think more thoroughly about, that we can valorize the humanities and its long tradition of information management into the future. So I applaud you for your efforts this week, and I hope you'll go out and accomplish those lofty goals. And I thank you for your time today.